Working humans are so much more than resources. This is one of the central lessons of the current crisis. This is also how the worldwide political call of several thousand scientists who are taking the corona pandemic as an occasion to demand changes in the world of work begins. This initiative is the result of a collective endeavor launched in May 2020 by 3 scholars who sat down and drafted an op-ed together about what we are learning from this pandemic around the specific issue of work. Their goal was to name clearly and urgently the core lesson they saw emerging. It is time to democratize firms, decommodify work, and remediate the environment. This exciting initiative was met with enthusiastic resonance. More than 6,000 scholars signed the petition. We will discuss the arguments behind these demands today with 3 of the main initiators of the call: Neera Chandhoke, Isabelle Ferreras, and Lisa Herzog. Hi, glad to have you here. So Neera Chandhoke is a national fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research and was formerly professor of social science at the University of Delhi. In her last book, Rethinking Pluralism, Secularism and Tolerance, Anxieties of Coexistence, Chandhoke examines how people of different languages, religions, and ethics live together with a degree of civility, dignity, and mutual respect. Isabelle Ferreras is a sociologist and a political scientist and professor at the University of Louvain in Belgium. In her book, Firms as Political Entities, Saving Democracy Through Economic Bicameralism, Ferreira suggests to organize firms in a bicameral structure that grants the same rights to workers as the ones held by capital investors. And we're going to talk about these suggestions in length. Lisa Herzog is associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and the Center for Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the University of Groningen. In her book, Die Rettung der Arbeit, Herzog argues for a political shaping of the present and future world of work that sees work as an essential source of social integration. And I am Rahel Jaeggi. I am a professor for social and political philosophy at the Humboldt University of Berlin and director of the Center for Humanities and Social Change in Berlin that is hosting this event as part of a series of events. And actually, since the center's focus this year will be labor and democracy, this is the first of many more events and discussions on this topic. In our first round, I want to address and go a bit deeper into the diagnosis and the concrete demands of the manifesto. The initial diagnosis that provoked the manifesto is to diagnose a crisis of work, the working place despotism that has to be addressed and that goes against our democratic expectation, but also the devaluation of work and the question of the dignity of work. Somehow, and this is what I find so exciting about this manifesto, since this is such a global initiative, it somehow comes as a surprise that this diagnosis is shared by so many scholars from all over the world, taking into account that there must also be a lot of differences because working conditions are so different in all these countries. Between global south and global north, probably the situation is not exactly the same. Between countries with welfare state arrangements and others and so on. So I would like to ask you to tell me a bit more about the current state of affairs with respect to work in your respective countries. How does the crisis of work look like in your country? How does this relate to the demands and to the analysis of the manifesto?
You know what is, and that is what attracted me to the manifesto. And when Isabel asked me to join in, I was very happy to do so because I think it serves as an anchor for enlarging our research agendas and for kind of going in different but related directions. I would, however, like to enlarge the background, expand the background conditions of the crisis in work and the crisis in the working class to a little more than the pandemic. What we witnessed since the second decade of the 21st century is a major reaction to globalization. This is something what we used to read about what happened after the countries were decolonized, and suddenly all the leaders wanted to control the economy and kind of manage their economic dynamics. And something similar had happened around the second decade. Because the 1990s was a period, if we look even at political philosophy, 1990s, first decade of the 21st century, was the time we were all discussing global justice and cosmopolitanism. A certain perspective onto the world that our destinies were interrelated. The problem was that with the reaction to globalization, we saw the upsurge of right wing populism across the world, and it has not escaped Europe. We have very many cases, or whether it's Italy, or whether it's Hungary, or whether it was the United States, or Philippines, or Russia, or Israel, or India. The advent of right wing populists who focused on a getting control of the economic levers of society and basically doing so by concentrating on a very muscular version of nationalism. The kind of nationalism that has emerged in our country, and I see this everywhere, wherever we see the advent of right wing populism, is a nationalism that glorifies violence, whether to security forces, and it has led to a great deal of vigilantism. Now, two things seem to have happened. One is the pushing off of cosmopolitanism from the agenda, and the second is subordinating the individual to the nation. And this, I think, has had a major reaction on working class solidarity, but also complete indifference to the state of the working class. There are 2 points which contribute to I would say, the downplaying of the working class in much of our part of the world. The first is the rise and now the decline of the subaltern group of historians. It was extremely exciting when this emerged in the 1980s because it was a Gramscian notion of the subaltern, and that should be our perspective on history. But the problem of the subaltern historians was that they were very closely aligned to post-colonialism and reaction against imperialism, with the result that the focus shifted from the working class and processes of work to cultural history. Everybody was doing cultural history. I remember being one of the few critics of this form saying, "You guys are pushing off the notion of work. I mean, what happens to the working class off the agenda?" And the reaction was, "What is more important is representation." So to literary history, cultural history, symbols, all kinds of fashionable theory coming to us from France via the United States. That was the first thing. I think the subaltern group of historians did a great deal to delegitimize the very profitable, even though it was very orthodox, the notion, socialist notions of work being the center of the social process and of the political process. So academically, one was really people were not, historians or scholars were not focusing on the working class, which was done during when they studied the national movement. But now they were looking at all kinds of subalterns without any grounding in political economy. And that really bothered me because I remember somebody pointing out at a conference, how can you have a subaltern history unless you look at the dominant classes? Or look at dominant histories. Now, unless you have a notion of the nature of work and the nature of capitalism, how do you foreground the issue of the working class? That is very important. But the more serious issue which led to a downgrading of labor was the shift from Fordist modes of accumulation to informational technology and the whole idea that you could now produce goods without using the working class. The manufacturing process was, however, devolved increasingly. So, with the result that with the shrinking of the working class in the factory production, and with the shrinking in the formal organized sector and modes of, for example, negotiation by trade unions, you have the informal sector coming up. Now, India has had a partial transition. It has not had a full transition from agriculture to industry. So, with the result that 96% of our working force, which works in sweatshops, doesn't unionize, because if you have less than 10 workers, you don't need to unionize. You don't have trade union laws applying to this section of the working force. But they are the ones who are creating everything from designer clothes to nuts and bolts. I mean, they are the entire onus of manufacturing has shifted onto this section of the working class. So actually, you see an expansion of the informal sector and a contraction of the formal sector. And this, I think, has had its impact upon the negotiating abilities of the formal work of trade unions. So my position is that we have to recognize that there has been a very, very major backlash when it comes to globalization. And this has had its impact not only upon the political philosophy of cosmopolitanism, but also international working class solidarity. And issues of workers' rights need to be reinstated. And this is, I think, the original manifesto, what it did, reinstate issues of the working class. And that is what attracted us to the three authors that had drafted the manifesto.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much. So, Lisa, I would like you to go on with your diagnosis of, I mean, what is the state of affairs with respect to work, democracy, and maybe especially with respect to the destiny of labor movements in Germany, who seem to have, I mean, some of the measurements that the manifesto suggests seem to have been in place more or less, or to a certain extent in Germany already, but at the same time, you're still diagnosing that there is a huge and dramatic crisis that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, thank you. That crisis was already in the making before Corona happened, I think. So the labor movement had made many steps to fight for things that sound like stuff we have in the manifesto, so co-determination, although the German model still always has a majority on the side of capital, except for the mining sector, which is almost non-existent these days. But the number of individuals working in these formal structures is declining, and the percentage of workers organized in unions is declining. There are many forms of informal work these days, sometimes organized through digital platforms, sometimes differently, seemingly self-standing individuals, Scheinselbstständigkeit in German. So even though, I mean, compared to India, this is of course a very different situation, but this process of eroding the formal structures in which workers have a certain degree of protection, a certain degree of voice, that I think is a trend that has sort of even reached the very well-organized German industry. And I think the sense that it has become much easier to fall down on the social ladder, as it were, to fall into precarious work, and the sense that the welfare state lets you survive but doesn't really secure social participation, that has also led to a great amount of anxiety among poorer people, but also wide into the middle class. And I mean, there are analyses about right-wing populism in Germany that say that this fear of social decline is one of the drivers that led people to vote for the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland. And what's quite interesting is that at the same time, there is this new work movement where you have startups, companies, consultants that talk about participation and new digital tools and lots of things that sound sort of democratic on the face of it, and that have seen an uptick with new digital technologies. And I mean, we're meeting here on Zoom, and everyone who has that kind of work is trying out new tools where you can coordinate digitally and so on. But that new movement that sounds like it might also be about participation in some way seems to be in a complete disconnect with the older union structures and the co-determination structures and the worker representatives. And I think it's also very different milieus in a way. And the elder union milieu sometimes seems to be a bit suspicious of these new forms of participation. And these new forms of participation there seems to be a lack of awareness that you actually need secure rights and not just nice to have digital voting tools in order to really shift the power balance. So there is this weird coexistence of different strands. And I think if they could go together, that would make for a very interesting political alliance, but that's not yet happening from what I can tell. And I mean, a huge question that is completely unresolved for the German workers' movement, unions, and so on, and that is really very difficult, is what to do about the supply chains and unionization of workers in German companies abroad or in their suppliers and so on. There are legal obstacles, but sometimes there also seems to be an unwillingness to even address this. I mean, you indicated at the beginning that giving workers voice doesn't mean that they will vote for the voice of other workers elsewhere worldwide. And so I think especially for a country like Germany that has so many international ties in its economic structures, that is really a big open question. What can be done to contribute to improving working conditions in the subsidiaries of German companies abroad and in the supply chain?
Well, seconding what Neera and Lisa just said, I think there is really a double movement going on. We see that even in the Western countries where the status of workers had been much better compared to obviously non-Western countries in terms of labor rights and in terms of income security, this situation has been degrading for some segments of the workforce. But at the same, so that makes for, if you want, a landscape of insecurities, feelings of anxieties around the globe, at the same time as we face the same challenge, which is to fight this pandemic. And so for all those essential workers who have been recognized as essential by their government and who yet are those who are less well paid, the supposedly low-skilled workers, well, these people are really investing so much energy at this very moment to serve other people, to drive them, to care for them, while we are in the retreat of our home, capable to Zoom. So this situation feels quite universal at this moment. And at the same time, the second layer here is to recognize that there is nothing new in affirming the principle that labor is not a commodity. This was the first sentence, the Article 1, right, of the Philadelphia Declaration that was signed after World War II by the ILO, the International Labour Organization's nations. And that felt as the principle that the nations should make it very clear that this should not be a principle to neglect again. Otherwise, new catastrophe would happen. Yet, this is what we've been doing. 60 years of economic development under neoliberal rules, which have only affirmed the principle that the labor market is the proper institution to govern work. And that, and here we are in dire problems. Yes.
Mm-hmm. So in the second round, I would like to go a bit deeper into the topic of democracy and democratization. So there's a whole bunch of problems that is addressed in the manifesto. There is the devaluation of work, the dignity of work, the precariousness of work. My question now is, how is democracy the solution to those problems? Why is it not, for example, raising wages? So Isabelle has come up with a very interesting analysis in her book, where she says there is a great contradiction between being a citizen and being an employee today. There is a great contradiction between the democratic culture of our times and the reality of the work experience. So she also has come up with a very concrete solution. I mean, the solution is democracy, democratization of the workplace. but she has also come up with a concrete measure that is a bicameral system. So again, my question is, on the general level, why is it democracy? How is democracy the solution? But also, how is the bicameral system supposed to work according to your thesis? Isabelle.
Thank you. But first, maybe let me say that I think, and we affirm actually in the manifesto that wages should be raised, obviously. So this is a basic requirement for the dignity of people, that certainly all those essential workers who are taking risks upon their life to go to work should be better compensated. That is obvious. But indeed, we say that it's not enough, because work is not about something that's instrumental. It's not something that you provide your employer or someone else, the customer, and that is detached from yourself. It's actually your own person that you fully engage in the work you're doing, the service you're providing. And so this is why, indeed, I speak of labor investment. People invest up to their own life and obviously their health in the situation of a pandemic, their physical health, but also their mental health, as we see with, us being on screens all day. We can very much, I think, feel now after 7 months of this, going through this pandemic, that this is about also our mental health. And so because it's such an important part of our life, because we invest ourselves fully in the work, whatever it is, it's indeed democracy is the solution, because it's about our person as an equal in society. And so here the very first principle of the Human Rights Declaration, the Universal Human Rights Declaration, is fundamental. We want to treat each other as equals in dignity and rights. Yet, once we enter the workplace, we actually are not equal. We are subordinate from a lower rank, and we are supposed to act according to rules that are given by some who are in a position to give those rules, to determine them. And that is what I call the capitalist despotism, which is the fact that in the workplace, in the context of a capitalist firm, certainly, those who have the right to voice the rules are those who represent or act as representatives of the capital investors. Yet, actually, no firm would exist without the labor investment of their workers. And these workers might be like fully recognized labor workers with a labor contract, but they might as well not be so much well recognized and being outsourced workers or gig workers. According to me, these people also qualify as labor investors in the firm. And to understand that firms are made of these two components, of course you need a capital investment, but you absolutely need a labor investment. For any firm to exist, then opens up the question of, well, why would only capital investors have the right to rule? This is actually a very difficult case to make. And labor investors actually indeed should gain the same right, and this is the principle that we affirm in the manifesto, is the idea that they ought to get the right to validate or veto the decisions. So collectively, workers, labor investors in the firm should get the right to also validate the decisions, so that is the law of the firm. Doesn't mean participatory democracy all the time. It means indeed that at least, but it could mean participatory democracy also, but at least, at the very least, workers should collectively validate the main decisions of the firm. Who is the CEO? What's the strategy of the firm? How are we dividing the profits coming from the activity? All that means to democratize firms. And indeed, if we want to democratize firms, what has happened in Germany, which is very important in the history of industrial relations with the Mitbestimmung, is not enough. We need to go to deepen that, if you want, by really granting workers the collective voice to validate or veto the decisions that currently only capital investors have the right to validate.
How does this proposition, how does this relate to a situation in which we have this huge realm of informal labor, precarious labor? So what do you think, Neera, about the bicameral system, democratization of work with respect to those different working conditions?
Yeah, I think it's a great idea if we can institutionalize the voice of the workers in management decisions. That really would be the ideal background for ensuring the dignity of labor. And I've had this little debate with Isabelle earlier. Within the working force, we encounter the classic problem of democracy, and that is representation. Of course, we have had representation in history without democracy, but we are talking of representation. Who represents the constituency, and more importantly, do marginal sections of the constituency even get represented? So I remember asking Isabelle, are you going to make special provisions, recommend special provisions for gender, for women? Because, within trade unions, all work has shown us that the women actually are not represented. For example, trade unions would have their meetings at late evenings. And women can't come because they're looking after the house and looking after children and cooking. So that kind of a problem, practical problems, preempt the needs of women from being represented in decisions, or what needs to be, what is it that the trade union leadership is representing. But more importantly, European trade unions, and we look at European trade unions as a model for negotiating with socialist democratic governments to lead to some kind of a social democratic state. They don't work in isolation, because a lot of the work that is being carried out in big firms is being subcontracted. The kind of work that is being subcontracted to the post-colonial world is high risk and low paid. All the dangerous work that is being subcontracted, even in electronics. The case of South Korea was scandalous. 20 years ago, everybody was talking about how these young women in South Korea were assembling these little, what do you call them, microchips, and literally going blind by the time they were 18 or 19 and forced to go into sex work. Now, when you have a whole chain of working class linkages between, say, the working class in the advanced industrialized countries, and the kind of work that is subcontracted or is opted for by firms, they would rather subcontract for a big company like Siemens, for instance, then who represents these workers? They don't have any representation at the local level. And do trade unions in the West, or in Europe most particularly, do they represent the interests of the working class that is doing these high-risk, low-paid jobs? Because of environmental regulations and because of this complexity of laws that has been enacted in Europe historically since the end of the 19th century, you do have a certain amount of protection for organized labor. Where does immigrant labor come in? The Turkish workers in Germany. I don't have to even talk about it to Europeans. You people know you guys know the problems of immigrant labor or black labor or Asian labor in Europe. Who is representing them? Are they being represented, their needs? The kind of the anti-immigrant backlash which has been launched by right-wing populists is not too conducive to looking at the working class as a whole.
I think we have to face that under those new conditions. There might be obstacles to even creating the demos of this democracy, or obstacles to creating conditions for collective actions that are somehow in the background of the idea that democracy should and will solve the problems addressed. Lisa, I would like to ask you to expand a bit on the problem of what kind of democracy is it that we need, because the German trade union experience is what comes closest to what from a different perspective in different countries might still be utopian, but still not only have you addressed and analyzed the decline of this system of participation, we are also, thinking about the past experience with this kind of participatory system. I think the question, how could we create a kind of working place democracy that actually gives those involved the feeling of not being under a despotic system, gives them the feeling of having a voice. This is the question of participatory democracy, of the kind of democracy that would even work on the micro level of the companies and the working place experience. So what kind of democracy do you think would we need in order to give content to the proposal of democratizing work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I guess I don't have a simple answer, because I think we need different democratic mechanisms at different levels. So I totally agree with Isabelle that where we have huge concentrations of power in the hands of the board members of large corporations, those power structures need to be democratized. And the way to go forward there is to include workers' voices, and maybe also the voices of other stakeholder groups, like patients in hospitals, for example, on these board level decision-making structures. I think that's very important, because it will shift the basic power structures within these organizations. But I also think that we need a very lively participatory culture in the workplace. And that's something where this new work form with all these digital tools and all these fancy new possibilities is actually interesting. And I think we can learn something from it, even if we don't share the underlying ideology there. Because it does give people a sense of having a say, participating, taking decisions together. And it has been a very old argument, and I think a very important one in the history of the theorizing about workplace democracy, which Carol Pateman has in particular emphasized, that by giving workers the opportunity to participate and to engage in democratic processes, you are actually also developing habits for citizenship. Because if we spend so much time at work, if we have no possibility of encountering others at eye level there, if it's always looking up or looking down and following orders, how are human beings supposed to learn what it means to engage in democratic encounters with their fellow citizens? There are certainly also other places. There are civil society organizations, there are, political parties, whatever. But given that work is such an important part of our lives, as our societies are currently organized, I don't think these other mechanisms can compensate when workplaces are strictly hierarchical and people don't have a voice and don't have any experience of actually making a difference. And it matters that I go to the office. I'm not just the cog in the wheel. There are other people there who are waiting for me. I have human relations on eye level with my colleagues, all these kinds of things. There is a lot of research in psychology on this apparent epidemic of burnout and depression, all these things. And my hunch is that the working conditions in many countries are one of the main drivers of these things, because people are really not experiencing themselves as agents and co-creators of the social relations around them in any meaningful way. And in terms of what form this can take, I'm sort of a pluralist when it comes to concrete mechanisms. I think, this tradition of teamwork, which sociologists have mostly done research about, or how can you organize teams where it's really horizontal and not vertical directions. That is very interesting. I think the whole cooperatives movement is also very interesting. I think cooperatives can also be a model for smaller businesses. Not everything is one of these big corporations where you have several board layers and so on, where the bicameral model makes sense. For like 10 people in a company together, what kind of representation can you have there? And what kind of mechanisms do you need to have in place in order to make sure that, this ideal, do you would say democracy as a way of life can also come about in the workplace. And I think there are examples of this, and there are far more cooperatives in the world than one would think when one just reads newspapers. So there's also sort of a disconnect between public discourse and the way it reports about the economy and all the alternative models that already exist and that are being experimented with at the moment. When I studied economics, I did a degree in Volkswirtschaftslehre, so macroeconomics. No lecture ever mentioned the cooperative principle. And I think that's still largely true today, and it's true for many business schools. So the plurality of forms that democratic and participatory workplaces can take, that's something that is totally left out of the official discourse about our economic systems. And I think that's a problem. And I think hopefully that will change. And in the democratizing work movement, or whatever you want to call it, network, they have a working group now that wants to look at syllabi development to actually teach the next generations of students about alternative forms of organizing work and finding the right model for different situations.
But then, and this is actually the next next question or huge topic that I want to address. What makes us think that those cooperatives don't compete with each other? What makes us think that this would create a situation that is better than, in the new economy or in the field of like startup economics, you sometimes have a situation where, less hierarchies. This is even part of new management strategies who found out that a certain kind of hierarchies are even undermining creativity and so on. And of course, this is also very ideological, but still can imagine a situation where it's less, let's say, the direct, not your boss at the company or the managers of the company that creates the kind of despotism that Isabelle is talking about, but the market or the forces of a certain kind of dynamic of growth that then would dictate decisions, working conditions on this level. So what makes you think that those, either cooperatives competing with other cooperatives or the working class having a voice in management decisions, why shouldn't they take into account the voice of the other parts of the working class? Let's say the global south, which is the most obvious deficit probably, but let's even say on the level of trying to create a new Green Deal, which is part of what the manifesto wants as well. What makes you think that the working class having a say, being part of managerial decisions, would vote such that the ecology, the ecological disaster, but also the exploitation of the global south wouldn't be in the picture anymore?
I'd love to make 3 points. The first one about this tension that you raised about the difference between the cooperative movement and the market. I think we actually have very solid examples that show that you could totally organize firms along democratic lines, and so make sure that the internal government inside firms be democratic, and yet have these firms thrive on the economy in a market economy. And it's, for instance, the example of Mondragon, which is a huge cooperative group based in Spain, and they've been super successful in the automobile industry, making chips for the German automakers. So it's actually, they are extremely competitive. And that proves actually that even in very adverse market conditions, because obviously our system does not favor cooperatives, yet they are extremely successful, which means that it's entirely possible. It's not like a dream, it's not a philosopher's dream to think about democratic workplaces. That was the first point. But now on your question, on your very question, I think here that two points I'd love to make. The first one is about this notion of labor investors. I truly think this is a helpful notion to inject in the discussion, because as I mentioned, if you want indeed to enter a perspective where you're not going to reproduce the old hierarchies of the past and truly mind for all working people around the world, in that sense be an internationalist really, you need such a concept. And with the concept of labor investors, we can recognize that, for instance, let's take Foxconn workers in China. We know that about 500,000 workers in China are actually manufacturing the Apple product. The one with which I'm actually talking to you, certainly, is coming from their hands. Yet these workers are certainly not considered as Apple workers. Yet, when you look into the organization of Apple, what you realize is that it's Apple engineers who actually monitor the work of these workers in China and who actually design the assembly line on which they are posted to manufacture these products. And we actually know that this is such a precise work that no automation in the coming years is going to make it possible to get rid of these workers. These workers are actually essential to Apple. Well, if we recognize that, then we really ought to ask ourselves the question, do we have the right legal framework for the organization of the economy today? I don't think so. And I don't think our manifesto indeed support that idea. In the manifesto, as we said already, we affirm this principle that those who are actually impacted by the decisions of the firm because they invest themselves in the firm should have the right to validate or veto the decisions. And actually, yes, Foxconn workers actually probably ought to be considered labor investors of Apple. And so we need to go beyond it. There is no reason to validate the current legal structuring of capitalism, and we need to go beyond the ability for firms to design like the complex a network of entities that they rely upon through the supposedly supply chain, the global supply chain, which is a way to actually avoid the tough questions. The tough questions are these questions of the responsibility of Apple, for instance, and the contribution of these Foxconn workers. And if you then enter into this thinking, then indeed you ought to wonder how we're going to get these workers the right to be represented in a structure, let's call that the global Apple entity, in which these workers are going to be represented, are going to validate the decisions that apply to them, and they're going to have a fair share of the pie, because they actually are central to the profits that today are only accessible to the Apple shareholders. So it's really about designing appropriate structure that would actually make it possible to fit this economy in our democratic creed in general. So that's the first point about the workers around the world. And the second point about the Green Deal, here I think the proposal that we put forth, which is the job guarantee, is actually very central also to to resolving what looks like an impossible situation. Indeed, we see that in many industries that we know are carbon intensive, there are going to be mass layoffs. We need to actually shift from away from certain productions. We need to do that very quickly. Obviously, if you do that without offering any possibility for workers not only to be retrained but actually to get a new job, they're going to be very against those decisions, obviously. And so here the job guarantee proposal which is the proposal on which Pavlina Cherneva, who wrote also a chapter in our book, Pavlina has been working on this proposal for 15 years and just published in June an excellent book which is called The Case for Job Guarantee at Policy Press. And she explains how this is a policy proposal that can really truly decommodify labor, by which we mean not to resort to the labor market to make the decisions of who among us is a useful person, who's not, and so that anyone who wants a job can actually activate that right to have a job, because this is a fundamental human right. And because today we need more jobs, we need jobs more than ever to precisely face the problem of climate change. And this is actually a central proposal in the Green New Deal, put forth by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the US, but it has not been central in the Green Deal, the European version. And we truly think that this should be actually part of the agenda in Europe as well, obviously, so that with those workers who are most threatened by the loss of their own position, we can actually organize, set up the jobs that they want to do. So in a very collaborative way, workers would, and that's really at the core of the proposal, workers would actually identify the types of jobs they want to do so that they can feel useful. These are meaningful jobs which will provide a decent wage.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I find it really intriguing. Also, I mean, the first suggestion that you made. I mean, I was about to say maybe we don't only need democracy here, but also revival of international solidarity. And without the kind of international solidarity, democracy on the level of the corporations and the firms might not be worth that much. But I mean, what you suggested, if you understand you rightly, is that along the lines of the economic structures and the interdependencies, there, I mean, to put it this way, there is already the global chain does already exist. So, in order to create solidarity, we should have to build on those chains and those interdependencies that already exist. So we would have not the whole, I mean, not the worldwide working class as such, but those solidarities that should and could build along the lines of the factual economic dependencies, interrelatedness, the relations that are already there in some ways. So I've found this intriguing. I mean, I was asking myself when it comes to the relation and the contradiction between the possible contradiction between economy and democracy. That should be solved by, I mean, that according to the manifesto should be solved by a certain, by introducing democracy in the world of corporations and the working place. There is a problem to be solved that is at the core of the economy itself here, and that's something. This has something to do with the question of how according to which kind of principle the economy itself is run. So it's not just about democratically taming the tiger, but about moving from an economy that is guided by profit making and a certain kind of capital accumulation to an economy that is guided by the needs of those who are involved, addressing those needs, and then building the economy around. And one could say, maybe when we are addressing the questions of how does democracy work on the level between the corporations, on the level between the nations, and so on, maybe we can't avoid this to discuss the very principles of economy here, which leads me to the question of decommodification and the way to address commodification. What does it mean to decommodify work? If in capitalism, one could say this is one of the defining elements of a capitalist economy, that you have a labor market and that you treat work as commodity. The way I read the manifesto is that it suggests the first step to decommodify work. Something that I would, building up on what Margaret Jane Radin has called partial decommodification. So of course, the job guarantee or a certain kind of labor rights might be part of not only the dignification of work, but also decommodification of work, because once there are certain limits to what you can do to the workforce, then of course this is no longer just an element in the market and not someone relying on market forces alone. But still, I want to go a bit deeper into the matter of decommodification and ask Lisa, what does it mean to decommodify work here, and how does a job guarantee decommodify or is part of decommodifying labor?
Yeah, thank you. So I would say that it's not so helpful to think about the commodification of labor as a complete either or. I think it's more helpful to think about it as a more or less commodified. And the more market regulation orients markets towards the satisfaction of people's actual needs, the less I will say it is already commodified. And then, of course, if the balance of power between workers and employers is also shifted through legal regulation, that also makes a huge difference. So I would say there's simply no justification whatsoever for a completely unregulated labor market. It always has to be heavily regulated to be justifiable in any way. And then the question is, how can we support work that is really motivated to satisfy needs? I think as a sort of phenomenological or sociological matter, lots of people perceive their work as much more than just doing a job against a wage. So in that sense, what you said about it being sort of partly commodified, partly decommodified, I think that's an experience that many, maybe also of us have, in the sense that there are these two sides. On the one hand, there is the intrinsic value and the contribution our work can make. And on the other hand, there is the contractual relation and what we're expected to do, and maybe some hierarchies and so on. And with more participatory and representative rights for workers, there's already, I think, a massive shift towards a sort of less commodified form of work. And then what the job guarantee would add is this exit option from the realm of work that would still, to some extent, probably be shaped by market forces, although, market forces within a strong social democracy are something very different than market forces in an unregulated market.
May I interrupt with respect to the job guarantee?
I'll just briefly explain the idea, and then we can discuss how this relates to decommodification. So the idea is not that you can get any job you want, because that's simply not feasible. We only need certain numbers of certain jobs in society. So that's also, I think, one of the reasons why it's very hard to think about a complete decommodification of labor, in the sense that there would be no competition for certain positions any longer. I mean, if you need a certain number of heart surgeons in society, we want the best suited people to get these jobs, but if there are more, there is going to be a certain degree of competition. That's sort of the other side of the freedom to choose an occupation that you're interested in. But what a job guarantee means is that you don't have to accept just any job, because you would have the possibility of entering an additional public labor market. So it would be publicly organized, presumably at the local level, because then you can respond to local needs. And I think that there should also be an element there of people suggesting jobs for that program to be included. If they have an idea about what work needs to be done, they should be able to suggest this to the local authorities. And it would be paid at least a minimum wage, maybe more. And very importantly, this objection sometimes comes up, it would not replace other kinds of benefit in the sense of a basic safety net. So it's not meant to be a sort of forced work for people, although politically some people are first saying that this could be difficult to actually instantiate, that it would be still voluntary. And the way in which it would contribute to the decommodification would be that people would know that they have the option of meaningful, decently paid and decently organized work. And that would introduce a sort of threshold for how work in the private market can also be organized. I mean, this is a bit similar like the argument that many people make in favor of an unconditional basic income, saying, well, that would also provide that kind of threshold, but a job guarantee would actually do it in a better way, because it would also have many of the other benefits of work beyond the provision of an income. And ideally, it would be combined with possibilities of training, also getting experience in participation and running the teams and so on. So all the democratic practices that we discussed earlier could also be practiced and installed there. And what the economists always like to emphasize is that this would also help to stabilize the economic system on a macro level, in the sense that it would act in a sort of counter fluctuating way. If there's an economic downturn, you'd have more public employment that would lead to more demand, and that would help dampen the crisis, and the other way around. So it would also have this stabilizing mechanism. So it would be, in a sense, a very Keynesian way of also embedding markets on a macro level and really ensuring the primacy of politics here. And that's why it's such an interesting proposal, especially in conjunction with the democratizing of firms, that there would really be no situation any longer where someone is forced to accept a certain job where they have no say, where they can't raise their voice. Because, even if there were some non-democratic firms, there would be this exit option into the job guarantee programs that would mean that if ever you get treated badly in a certain way in some other kind of job, you'd have this exit option. That's the basic argument. And that's also why these two proposals hang together so well.
Because it would strengthen the bargaining position of those who are involved. Yeah.
That indeed it would actually annihilate the reserve army. So in terms of balance of power, we would enter a totally different world. And indeed, it's very important, as Isa says, to see that these principles work together. The democratization works together with the decommodification, and that's also how we think it's going to help remediate the environment. And these principles, as I said earlier in the seminar, are not new principles, but probably what's new or what's original in our manifesto is that we really tried to take them seriously together as a set of principles which we think actually reinforce one another, and thus provide a framework to think about, to lay out another paradigm to organize our economy so that it fits planetary boundaries and sustain democracy as a project for our societies.
Thank you so much for participating in this discussion. I think we have to go back to, all those really, really important, interesting issues. And I'm looking forward to work with you on this project and to continue the discussion. And I really, really hope that this will help to put this pressing issue on the agenda, on the political and the philosophical and theoretical agenda once more. So thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Rahel. Thank you so much.
Bye.